When Liverpool fans hear the word mid, plenty of names come to mind. Players who weren't disasters, but also never truly lived up to the hype. You might think of Emil Heskey, a striker who worked hard, but never really convinced as a lethal finisher. Or Salif Diao, a midfielder who arrived with promise, but became more of a squad filler than a star. Maybe Florent Sinama-Pongolle, who showed flashes of potential, but never consistently delivered. Some would even argue Vladimir Smica or Charlie Adam at certain points, players who were arguably solid and dependable, but rarely spectacular. All of these players have their cases. They had their moments, their positives and their frustrations. But for me, there's one player who embodies the word mid more than anyone else who wore the red shirt in the 21st century. Igor Biscan. Biscan is the perfect example of that strange footballing category. He wasn't a flop, he stuck around, played nearly over 100 games, and earned a Champions League medal. But he was never a success either. He arrived at Anfield as a highly rated Croatian midfielder. Yet most of his time on Merseyside was defined by awkward performances, positional uncertainty, and a reputation as the player fans dreaded seeing on the team sheet. And yet, he still managed to carve out a cult hero legacy. In this video, we're going to look at Igor Biscan's journey in 3 parts. Before Liverpool, to understand what kind of player the club thought they were signing. During Liverpool, where the chaos, frustrations, and occasional redemption took place. And after Liverpool, where he quietly rebuilt his reputation away from Anfield. So, let's dive into the strange tale of Igor Biscan, Liverpool's definition of mid. Igor Biscan's story begins in his hometown of Zagreb, where, like so many Croatian talents of the 1990s, like Slaven Bilic and Vedran Čorluka, he came through the famous Dinamo Zagreb Academy. At the time, Dinamo was more than just a club. It was the factory of Croatia's golden generation, producing stars who would go on to shine across Europe. Biscan was no exception. He was initially loaned out to a smaller local club, NK Samobor, where he picked up valuable first-team experience. That short spell toughened him up and allowed him to show his versatility. Even then, he was a curious type of player. Tall, physical, but also technically competent on the ball. He wasn't the elegant playmaker, nor the destroyer, but something in between. By the late 1990s, Biscan has established himself as one of Dinamo's key midfielders. He was part of a side dominating Croatian domestic football, racking up league titles and cup wins. More importantly, his performances began catching the eye outside of Croatia. He could run with the ball, he could break up play, and he wasn't afraid of physical battles. In a league that often exported its best talent abroad, Biscan looked like the next in line. That promise was recognised on the international stage. He made his debut for Croatia in 1999, just a year after the national team had stunned the world with their 3rd place finish at the 1998 World Cup. Breaking into that squad was no easy task. It was packed with stars like Davor Suker, Zvonimir Boban, and Robert Prosinecki. But Biscan still managed to get his call up, which underlined the regard people had for him at the time. And in truth, he was being seen as one of the hottest prospects in the region. Clubs around Europe were circling, with reported interest from the likes of Juventus and AC Milan. Here was a 22-year-old midfielder with a Champions League pedigree, having captained Dinamo in Europe, and with a reputation as a player ready to make the next step. So, when Liverpool swooped in December 2000 with a fee of around £5.5 million, it wasn't out of nowhere. It was a statement signing for Gerard Houllier. Liverpool weren't just buying a squad player, they believed they were getting a future midfield general, a Croatian star who could add quality and leadership to their squad. Biscan arrived at Anfield with a growing reputation, a handful of international caps, and the expectation that he'd become a vital part of Liverpool's next era. At that moment in time, he wasn't seen as a gamble. He was seen as a rising star. Of course, what happened next would be something very different. Igor Biscan's Liverpool career began in December 2000. And right from the start, it was clear that his time at Anfield was going to be unusual. Gerard Houllier eased him into the squad, but instead of being the commanding midfielder fans had expected, Biscan often found himself shuffled around in unfamiliar roles. One week, he might be asked to anchor the midfield. The next, he'd be filling in at centre-back. That lack of stability became a theme of his 5 years at the club. On the pitch, Biscan's performances were mixed at best. He had the size and work rate to compete in English football, but his awkward touch and indecision in possession meant he never looked truly comfortable in the Premier League. There were games where he quietly did his job, breaking up play and moving the ball on. But those were usually overshadowed by matches where his mistakes or hesitancy stood out. Fans never really trusted him, and his name on the team sheet often brought more anxiety than excitement. Yet, Biscan wasn't a complete liability. Every so often, he put in performances that hinted at why he'd been so highly rated in Croatia. His stamina and willingness to battle gave Liverpool depth, and in certain games, particularly in Europe, he looked more at home. When Rafa Benitez arrived in 2004, Biscan could easily have been moved on. Instead, he became something of a surprise figure in that season's Champions League run. Against Bayer Leverkusen and Juventus, he played some of the best football of his Liverpool career. Disciplined, hardworking, and even creative at times. Those performances didn't erase years of frustration, but they did earn him a measure of respect. By the time he left in 2005, Biscan had made 72 appearances and scored 2 goals. His Anfield career was hard to categorise. Not a disaster, not a triumph. Just somewhere in between. And in other words, the very definition of mid. When Igor Biscan left Liverpool in the summer of 2005, it would have been easy to assume his career was heading on a downward trajectory. After all, in England, he'd become more of a punchline than a star. But instead of fading into obscurity, Biscan went on to show that he still had plenty to offer at a high level. His first stop was Panathinaikos, one of the biggest clubs in Greece. There, he slotted into a team that was expected to challenge for domestic honours every season and compete in Europe. At Panathinaikos, Biscan was no longer the awkward figure Liverpool fans remembered. He became a reliable, hard-working presence in midfield. His physicality and experience gave the side stability, and supporters in Greece appreciated his consistency. For 2 seasons, he remained a regular fixture, proving that while he hadn't quite lived up to the hype at Anfield, he was still more than capable of performing at a big club. After Greece, Biscan returned home to Dinamo Zagreb in 2007. By then, he was an experienced veteran, and he brought leadership to a squad that was already dominating Croatian football. Back in familiar surroundings, he helped Dinamo continue their run of domestic success, winning league titles and cups while adding maturity to the midfield. For young players coming through, Biscan became an example of professionalism, a player who had experienced both the glamour of the Premier League and the grind of European competition. He eventually retired in 2012, but football wasn't finished with him. Biscan moved into coaching, starting with smaller roles before working his way up. He managed Dinamo Zagreb, adding more silverware to his CV, and later took charge of Croatia's under-21 national team. In coaching, just as in his playing days, he wasn't a flashy figure grabbing headlines, but he was steady, respected, and dependable. Looking back, Biscan's post-Liverpool career shows that he was never a flop. While he didn't become a superstar, he carved out a reputation as a trustworthy professional who could be relied upon at clubs with high expectations. In many ways, that summed him up perfectly. Not spectacular, not disastrous, just solid, just mid. And there we have it. When you look back at Igor Bišćan's career as a whole, something stands out. He never made more than 100 appearances for any single club. Yet, across 17 years as a professional, he was almost always around at a pretty high level. Dinamo Zagreb, Panathinaikos, Liverpool, these weren't small names. He played for big clubs, in big competitions, and for a respected national team. And yet, for all that, Bišćan never quite became a household name. He wasn't the player you built a team around. He wasn't a star on the back of shirts. But he wasn't a flop either. There was no catastrophic collapse, no embarrassing spiral down the divisions. Instead, he existed in that strange middle ground. He was there when he was needed, and when he wasn't, he simply drifted out of view. That's why, in hindsight, Igor Bišćan feels like the true definition of mid. Nothing in his career sets the tone of him being remembered as a failure. But nothing about him demands he be remembered as a star either. He was there for Liverpool, for Croatia, for Dinamo, for Panathinaikos. And in the end, maybe that was what mattered most. Igor Bišćan, Liverpool's definition of mid.